I'm Madison Mills. This is Bloomberg Quick Take. The most political moment of the 2022 Winter Olympics is now upon us. Friday's opening ceremony in Beijing will give President Xi Jinping a chance to reset his country's image. But it'll be an uphill battle. Reports of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, suppression of dissent in Hong Kong, and tensions around Taiwan have pushed opinions about China to historic lows. Plus, new details are emerging about how the Chinese government is ramping up efforts to surveil athletes and journalists in Beijing ahead of the Games. Sarah Cook, research director of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at the nonprofit Freedom House, joins us now to discuss. Sarah, welcome to Quick Take, and thanks for being here. I know a big goal of China is to use the Games as sort of a rebranding effort. What do you anticipate their strategy looking like, particularly as we head into the opening ceremony tomorrow night?
Look, I think there's going to be a lot of pomp, and they're going to try to do their best to make this conflation between China and its rich history and culture and the Chinese Communist Party, which is essentially a brutal dictatorship. And one of the main messages that the Chinese Communist Party uses both at home and abroad is to blur those lines, to try to make people, who feel positively about China, understandably, also feel positively about the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's going to be one of their goals. Another goal is basically to make sure that nothing goes wrong that departs from that they're going to do whatever they can to control the message and control what happens during the ceremonies and throughout the Games.
Well, we'll get to censorship at the Games in a little bit, but I also want to ask you about some of the attendees. Xi Jinping hosting 21 world leaders, including Vladimir Putin. But from research from your organization and several other nonprofits, we know that 12 of the leaders are from countries classified as non-democracies. Does that not kind of hurt the rebranding goal here?
It does, and it's absolutely a difference from 2008, where you may recall then President Bush actually attended the Games.
Yeah.
That being said, it's a pretty common propaganda tactic by the Chinese government to have foreign leaders, including from other authoritarian regimes or not non-democracies, come to China and speak kindly about the party, and then they basically quote that and play that back, to domestic audiences. So I think for domestic audiences, it may be that having, these leaders there will help. I think internationally, as you said, it's pretty glaring, the absence and really the difference from 2008 in terms of who's not there.
Yeah, let's talk about the differences between '08 and now. You mentioned former President Bush's attendance in '08. I mean, what do you attribute the kind of renewed or potentially even increased tensions this time around to?
Well, first of all, China is as authoritarian and not free as it's been for a very long time. It is much more repressive and authoritarian. So when Freedom House, we do ratings on the level of freedom, back then, China was already deeply not free. It had like a 17 or so out of 100. That's not a good grade. It's at a 9 now. So you're taking a country that was already deeply repressive and has gotten even that much more repressive and horrific in its human rights violations. And I think, it's that reality that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to change, that it's trying to cover up, and that has triggered so much pressure and conversation. And ultimately diplomatic boycotts. I think it's both their own actions and a greater level of, I would say, just international awareness and documentation of what's going on and the horrors of what are the atrocities being committed that have just made it that much more unpalatable for leaders of democratic countries to attend in person and contribute to this kind of pomp and attempted distraction from what's happening in China.
Yeah, there's definitely an increased level of awareness, especially with the situation with Uyghur Muslims in the area. And that's led to a lot of activists and just viewers pushing athletes and even NBC to speak out against the Chinese government while they are there. However, athletes are subject to IOC rules and Chinese law while they are in Beijing. What can they do and what can they not do as they head to, press interviews and also just participate in these games?
Well, I think it's everybody's individual choice. According to the Olympic rules, the IOC charter, there are limitations on the kinds of protests or demonstrations that someone might do on the podium, for example, right?
Yeah.
And that could, relate, have some sanctions. Otherwise, actually, according to their rules, athletes are able to say whatever they would like on social media or in press interviews. And even at the Tokyo Olympics, some of the rules were a little bit more loose and say at the broader venues. So if this were in China, there would actually be a quite, and it was in a more open country, there would be a much more open environment. I think the real test is going to be, because of the situation in China and so many different kinds of speech being curtailed and punished with, legal reprisals for people in China, not just if you're talking about abuses, say, against Uyghur minorities or Tibetans, but if you're just talking about your faith, if you're, if you're somebody who practices the Falun Gong meditation, if you're trying to expose torture that somebody, experienced, if you're just sharing a cartoon about Xi Jinping, we know people who have been sentenced to prison for that. So I think, the red lines are constantly moving in China, and that's what's really tricky. My guess is that what you're going to see happen is that I think athletes, understandably, are going to be very careful about what they say before they compete. I think the question is, after they compete and are getting ready to leave anyway, if we'll see people opening up more. And I think certainly, potentially, once people come back, we may see people speaking out more, not just about the human rights violations in China, but how they experience the surveillance and so forth. But we'll have to see. It may very well also be that there will be athletes that and others, that will speak out, and we'll just have to see what happens. I would hope that there would be a degree of international spotlight and pressure that would protect them from, not basically being prosecuted by the Chinese state the way ordinary Chinese citizens are.
Right. That's a really good point, that the situation might change after they've competed. Right now, we're obviously just in pre-interview stages, so that could be changing the tenor of these conversations. You mentioned surveillance of these athletes. Tell me what we know about what that looks like for them on the ground.
Well, athletes are walking and journalists are walking into the most sophisticated apparatus of information control in the world, and a pervasive surveillance state, one that is much, much, much more advanced than it was even just in 2008. So if you look at some of the advisories, not just from some of the Olympic teams, but say from groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, they're quite explicit about what attendees, should be wary of. They should take burner phones. They should create separate email addresses. They should assume that their hotel rooms are being monitored and surveilled. One of the things that's come out is that the actual app that's required, because it's collecting, health information related to COVID because of the COVID protocols at the games, actually has a lot of security vulnerabilities, but also has these kind of politicized features where users can report on each other for political speech that, say, steps out of what is permitted in China, and even some built-in censorship for certain phrases that the Chinese government might not like.
Yeah, so a very, very intense situation there, Sarah. In our final minute here, what is kind of, when we take a step back, big picture here, what do you think is something that could have the biggest impact on the world stage in terms of just awareness about the situation in China and regarding reports of human rights abuses? Would it be dissidents from athletes skipping the opening ceremony, maybe coverage from an NBC? What do you think would potentially have the biggest impact?
I think coverage from broadcasters like NBC is critical. I think interviews with the victims is so critical, because this isn't just allegations from here. We have very clear documentation, but China's Communist Party documents, are interesting to people like me, but may not speak to a lot of others. But these are real people with families that have disappeared, parents that can't speak to their children, people who have survived horrific forms of torture. So that's what I would hope. I would hope that whether it's an athlete who speaks out, or maybe something happens to them, hopefully not, or the coverage that it has, and we've seen some of this already, it tells that human story, that story of the people who are voiceless in China, and that to really give them a voice as the Chinese Communist Party tries to gain this real propaganda coup.
Yeah, really passing the mic and making sure those voices are heard. Sarah, thank you so much for that context. Really appreciate it. That was Sarah Cook. She's Research Director of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at the nonprofit Freedom House.